just want to spend a couple of minutes telling you about this effort, where it's headed, and getting hopefully as a prompt to get your thoughts and input, because this is very much about engaging citizens that are not steeped in the policy discussions that take place where policymakers tend to talk to each other in Washington on a regular basis. Instead, we're eager to get out and try to find the right narratives, the right kinds of engagement opportunities to begin to drive a wider conversation. We began by establishing a task force, a high-level bipartisan task force that we thought could help galvanize a course of action, and starting with an articulation of some of these core principles that many of you have in front of you. The task force is led by former U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and Steve Hadley, the former National Security Advisor under George W. Bush. Carl Bildt, former Swedish Prime Minister, and a former Japanese Prime Minister are also part of the task force, including many countries and former leaders from democracies around the world. The idea was that by bringing together a bipartisan group, we demonstrate that there is an interest and a commitment to upholding some sort of some set of values that can continue to play a role in advancing a narrative for American leadership and global leadership in framing the future of the global order. So these efforts, after rounds of discussion, led to a declaration, a set of core principles for freedom, prosperity, and peace, a document that we released a couple of months ago, which reflects 7 basic principles that have been at the heart of a free and open world. Essentially, this is a campaign around what do we stand for, what are we for, rather than simply lamenting what we're against or what the challenges we're facing. And you saw in the video, I won't repeat them, the 7 core principles that have shaped or have played a role in shaping our engagement in the past, those that we believe and that the folks who signed on to this document believe should continue to play a role in grounding our engagement in the world. The Declaration provides a compelling and powerful statement of values, a sort of a North Star around which political leaders in the United States and elsewhere can coalesce. And we see it as serving 2 purposes. One, it provides a rallying cry to mobilize bipartisan support within our own publics to sustain those values, even at a time when they're being questioned. And second, to rally the democratic world to try to rebuild the democratic community, which for many years thought it had a grounding around a certain set of values and a certain set of rules and norms for global engagement. The first part of our approach is to build this kind of a campaign with endorsements and engagements from private sector leaders, from legislators, from citizens and students here in the US and elsewhere. The youth are particularly important, we believe, because the future and our future will very much depend on sustaining a commitment to a set of core principles that have to be embraced by the next generation. And the second part of our approach is to ensure that we have a coalition of democracies that continue to support and favor these principles. That's why we started with a high-level group of former senior leaders from democracies that have influence in their own countries. We're seeking to back that with a legislative caucus of leaders from these countries that are in positions of influence from where they sit in their parliaments. The notion is that even if the executive leadership is unwilling or unable or uncertain as to where it stands, having a core network and a core commitment by legislators remains fundamentally important. We've seen that in action here in our own country. Congress recently passed legislation, a resolution endorsing NATO, the NATO alliance, by wide margins on both sides of the aisle, and making it much more difficult if the administration decided at some point that it wanted to scale back its commitments to NATO. So that kind of legislative support, we believe, is essential, especially at a time like this. So in sum, we believe that the world's democracies, starting with the United States, are suffering a crisis of confidence. People are questioning those basic principles. They're questioning the value of global engagement and how we should be positioning ourselves in the world, the basis of free societies. And the adoption of this declaration, as Secretary Albright has put it, is an opportunity to renew our vows, to create greater understanding of what these mean, why they're important, both here at home and to citizens elsewhere. Principles, of course, are just a starting point. The real question is, what do we do with them? How do we implement them? How do we create action around them at a time when we're not likely to see a lot of that action coming from our government, our own government? At the same time, there are many, many new challenges that have to be addressed, from the rise of new technologies and their impacts on our societies, from wealth and income disparities that have led to a lot of the fragmenting of support for the order, migration pressures, climate change. I mean, you know, the list of challenges has only expanded, not diminished over the years. But having said that, any of these, having a set of values and principles to orient and provide direction is fundamentally important before developing a strategy and a plan of action to implement them, especially when we know, I think, at a time like this, we're not likely to see proactive executive action in terms of creating or reorienting a global order that's conducive to some of these principles. So in the meantime, our sense is what we ought to be doing is looking for ways to reconnect with our own publics, with legislators, rebuilding a narrative, recreating a bipartisan commitment to a values-based foreign policy. And so that elected leaders, the next time there's an election, and those who are running for office know that there's a constituency, there are people who care about what America's role in the world should be, and that to have that reflected in a document and a kind of a notion of where we should be leading.